One Piece had some pretty absurd censorship, and some of them, in my opinion, should be punishable by the law. They actually took out Smoker's iconic cigars and just left the smoke. But that doesn't beat when they replaced Helmeppo's gun with, what is this? And topping all has to be censoring all the alcohol they drank to be orange juice. But these are just some of the obvious censorship. Later we will be covering crazier, obscure ones. Like when the 4Kids adaptation changed Sanji's cigarette to a lollipop. Like really, bruh. And yet another change in the 4Kids anime is changing the Marine's text to say Navy. I don't get it. Is this even considered to be censorship? Maybe not. But I bet you wouldn't guess that they would actually switch all their guns to water soakers, because that's what pirates use apparently. Really intimidating, I guess. There's a price to pay for making the show family-friendly, but does being family-friendly mean the poison spikes should be changed into plungers? Does it also mean we get to have no blood at all? Answer me, 4Kids. In fact, throughout the whole 4Kids dub, there was actually no blood shown. It's at least better than China's version, where all the blood is censored to be white. But have you ever wondered where Luffy got his face scar from? Well, in the manga, Luffy actually gets his own scar by cutting his own face within the first 5 pages. But in the anime, they just completely censored it, and it took a whole 800 episodes to finally show us. The anime really made us wait a long time for that one. We all know Oda is famous for drawing women with the most accurate of figures, so this next censorship is where the dreams of young boys go to die, because 4Kids always ends up censoring anything that has to do with women's... well, you get the idea. But this next censorship will make you question a lot, because unlike what we see in the anime, where Zeff cuts his leg with an anchor to save Sanji's life, Zeff actually eats his own leg in the manga to survive. I would rather eat Sanji instead. So yeah, this scene was so dark, Toei had to censor it and replace it with the anchor scene in the anime. And although it makes sense, we have to agree this is such a disservice to the character. But we aren't done with Sanji yet. During the Baratie arc, when Sanji agrees to cook for Don Krieg, all the chefs are angry at him and they hold up these oversized kitchen utensils. Ridiculous, right? But in the manga, the chefs are actually holding guns up to Sanji's head. This change was made since guns were banned in all of the 4Kids adaptation. However, this next censorship is considered more ridiculous since 4Kids changed the iconic "We Are Opening" into some ridiculous rap. I personally think it's fire. Smoker in the 4Kids adaptation is actually called Chaser. This makes sense since they didn't want kids to learn about smoking from One Piece anyway, but this is only one of the many name changes. Another example comes from Ace, who was called Trace in the 4Kids adaptation. This one makes no sense, 4Kids, but that isn't as bad as the next censorship. You wouldn't guess you have been saying Zoro wrong this entire time. Roronoa Zoro is actually called Roronoa Zolo, and if you know anything about Japanese, this would make a lot of sense, because R and L are actually seen as the same. So the translators just threw a dart and picked one of them, but it didn't get fixed later on, because Viz Media didn't want any copyright issues with another swordsman named Zoro. One other iconic name change by the 4Kids adaptation is King Cobra to King Nebra. At this point, I don't really understand what 4Kids is doing. Now Zoro in the manga is way more unhinged than Zoro in the anime, since when you look at the earliest chapters of the One Piece manga, Zoro does some things that really make him look evil. In the beginning of the anime, we see Helmeppo sending his wolf to attack Rika, but Zoro throws a chair at it and just knocks it out. However, in the manga, Zoro actually just kills the wolf in cold blood. Dude was really hardcore, man. Anyways, speaking of Zoro, another big censorship in the anime as opposed to the manga is while Zoro is fighting Kabaji of the Buggy Pirates. Zoro intentionally lets Kabaji stab him to give Kabaji a slight advantage, but in the manga, Zoro's even more badass as he actually just stabs himself to give Kabaji an advantage. What a guy. Now that censorship pretty much makes sense. Also, 4Kids made a huge effort to censor anything connected to religion. So in this scene, while Zoro was tied up in the courtyard at Axe-Hand Morgan's house, they removed the top of his post because they thought Zoro resembled too closely Jesus on the cross. They also went as far as removing Mihawk's cross necklace as well as his long sword handle. This is blasphemy! Inappropriate clothing is something that the One Piece South Korean release would change entirely, as they decided to give Nami a shirt to wear in scenes where she is just wearing a bra. This is because South Korea has some pretty weird rules about clothing in the media.
Luffy's abilities and attacks are one of the reasons that everyone loves Luffy. However, did you know that one of his most iconic abilities was completely censored by 4Kids? His ability known as Gum Gum Pistol was changed to Gum Gum Blast because no guns. Speaking of attacks, we know 4Kids has a pretty weird and inconsistent policy around violence, since while fighting against the buggy pirates they cut some scenes. Most notably, whenever Luffy punched any of them in the face, it was either removed or the impact of the punch was taken out entirely. They would eventually relax this policy a bit, since Luffy does punch quite a few people in the face throughout the entire One Piece anime. This next censorship might make some sense if you take a close look. When we were first introduced to the character Pork SD Ace in the anime, we see his iconic Whitebeard back tattoo. But in the manga, instead of the cross, he has another symbol. And I know how this looks, but this is actually the manji, a symbol of prosperity, happiness, and luck. But obviously in the West, it would be known for a very different reason. So it was changed to be a cross. 4Kids made a huge effort to censor a lot of things revolving around Japanese culture across countless anime. However, for One Piece, it probably saw the most censorship of just about any anime ever. For example, do you remember in the early days when Zoro was held captive on Shell's Island in a Navy base? This little girl brings Zoro some rice balls, but in the 4Kids version, she brings some pretty horrendous looking cookies. Bruh. What's the need to do that? And since we are talking about censoring Japanese culture, Mr. One's chest tattoo, and to be honest, just about any Japanese text at all, was removed entirely from the 4Kids adaptation of the anime. Now shifting gears entirely, Quina's death is a really tragic event in Zoro's story. However, the censorship here is absolutely wild. In the 4Kids cast version, Quina doesn't actually die, but is rather jumped by a group of men and forced to retire. Now this makes absolutely no sense for Zoro's character, since Quina's death really sets up his ambitions, but they actually also did this with Bellemere, since Arlong doesn't actually shoot her but rather imprisons her. Surely this would make Nami a bit less motivated. Understandable, I guess, but weird. Another shocking moment in the East Blue Saga comes from when Nojiko and Nami are fighting off the Marines at Bellemere's Tangerine Farm, when suddenly Nojiko is shot by the Marine Captain Nezumi. But in the manga, Nojiko was actually shot by what appears to resemble an entire firing squad. Firing squads were a common execution method throughout history, so the censorship is evidently trying to hide that little fact. They also changed another part of Zoro and Quina's backstory. While Zoro and Quina are discussing that Zoro will one day overtake her, Quina seems to grab her developing chest to indicate that she'll one day be overtaken by Zoro because she is a girl, and of course 4Kids made sure to completely eradicate this. That is not all that was changed about Zoro, since in the South Korean release of the anime, Zoro's swords have been recolored to be completely black in certain scenes, because the silver makes them resemble weapons too much, apparently, since it seems we didn't notice that they are in fact swords. Bruh. Anyway, devil fruits are the most iconic part of One Piece by far, and everyone is super excited to see when Luffy will come face to face with another wielding the powers of said devil fruits. Wait, hang on, did I just call them devil fruits? That can't be right. Sorry guys, I meant to say the cursed fruits because that's what 4Kids calls them. Yeah, censorship can be really annoying. These were not the only things that were removed from the 4Kids adaptation, as they completely removed Little Garden, meaning they completely removed the Giants and Mr. 3's introduction, which was at first meaningless but eventually became a huge loss to the series, because you'd have to ask the question, who is the guy that saved Ace and why is he here? Or what is Elbaf? Yeah, being a show about pirates, obviously the characters were going to use guns. But in the 4Kids adaptation, while fighting Captain Kuro, they removed the gun used by Kuro and Usopp and replaced it with a slingshot. I mean, the gun never really worked that well to begin with, but it's better than the slingshot. I blame you, Usopp. You're the cause of this. One of the things One Piece has done amazingly well for years is character design, but 4Kids ruined it, not only by censoring female busts, but general design. They not only changed Ace's name, but removed the tattoo that said Ace. And would you be surprised to hear that the creators of the manga and anime actually come together and work on different stories together? Well, a great example of this comes from the character Sabo. His backstory was never actually included in the manga, but was included in the anime. This is exactly what Oda had written as the character's backstory, but just never had time to put it in there, so instead gave the draft to the showrunners and basically said go all in. And that's exactly what they did. In the anime, Luffy's biggest dick rider, Bartolomeo, loves Luffy so much that he can do anything for him, literally to the extent of beating up anybody who badmouths him. During the Dressrosa arc inside the Colosseum,
Bartolomeo hears someone talking shit about Luffy, and then beats him to a bloody pulp, grabs his tongue, and threatens to cut it off. Well, in the manga though, Bartolomeo's love for Luffy seems to be considerably larger than that, actually goes through with cutting the guy's tongue out, and then strolling into the Colosseum. Speaking about the anime changing things, in the anime, Akainu and Whitebeard's battle is fierce, and it eventually leads to Akainu blowing up half of Whitebeard's mustache. But in the manga, this battle has far more dire consequences, since during this battle Akainu actually blows off half of Whitebeard's face.
Sanji is a very interesting character within the world of One Piece, and we know in the anime he's quite the woman lover and would never hurt a woman at all. One thing that was removed from the anime but kept in the manga was Sanji trying to buy someone. Yes, straight up buy her, money transaction, receipt, everything. During the auction house scene, Sanji asks if he can buy her. In the anime, they change it to Sanji being furious at how they can treat people this way. Yeah, definitely a character moment. This next censorship is truly dark, because when the Wano ladies are slowly starving, Luffy and his crew just come in at the nick of time to save everyone from starvation. But this scene looked a whole lot different in the manga, I'll tell you that. This town was actually just minutes away from ending it all. That's when Luffy and Zoro brought a whole lot of food to the island. Now this censorship makes a whole lot of sense. Another interesting character is Bellamy. Very menacing, actually. More than just interesting within One Piece. And this is no more evident than his card game against Roshio. Bellamy must be a pretty sore loser, as he actually ends up stabbing him in the hand, shooting him in the leg, and then smashing a bottle of alcohol on his head. But buckle up, ladies and gents, because Bellamy ain't even done yet, because in the manga, Bellamy's crew decided to join in the fight and set Roshio on fire. Now I get why this was censored, because that's really traumatizing. Next up, we've got Mr. Three's brawl against the Giants, and this scene is peak in its entirety, don't get me wrong. But the manga made this far more terrifying. In the anime, Mr. Three made use of giant shackles to subdue the Giants, but in the manga, giant swords run through their hands. That had to hurt. My hands are sweaty thinking of the pain. Yeah, it was pretty bad. Speaking of painful, Zoro wasn't done justice here. In the Little Garden arc, when Zoro, Nami, and Vivi were restrained by Mr. Three to be turned into wax statues, Zoro threatens to cut his leg so he could get a chance to escape. But in the manga, Zoro actually begins cutting his leg, and was already halfway through it. This has to be painful to watch.
Okay guys, if you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, and comment down what you think. And I will see you in the next one.